Hello and welcome to this special edition of Broadcasting Beyond. My name is Mohammed Saleh. The city of Bakhmut has been reduced to ruins. And according to many military experts, this is now proving to be one of the most decisive battles of this war so far. The Russian mercenary Wagner Group has been at the forefront of the fighting to try and capture Bakhmut. The chief of the Wagner mercenaries, Yevgeny Prigozhin, has in fact gone around prisons, recruiting convicts to fight on the battlefield in Ukraine. And has in fact made this battle of Bakhmut to be a bit of a prestige issue for him personally. Remember, recently Yevgeny Prigozhin also complained about not getting enough ammunition to fight. Prigozhin has also criticized the tactics that have been employed by the regular Russian forces. So essentially, Prigozhin's reputation and also his clout in Moscow now hinges on the fate of Bakhmut. If Russia manages to seize Bakhmut, then this course could prove to be a staging ground with which Russia could threaten other urban areas such as Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. So the question, of course, is this: a victory in Bakhmut for the Russians, will it just be a psychological triumph, or would it end up changing the tide of war, making it harder for Ukraine to in fact defend other urban areas which Russia could target next? To discuss this and more, we're being joined by Colonel David Roche. Roche, who is now joining us live from Washington, D.C. Colonel, thank you very much indeed for taking time out and speaking to us here on Beyond. The question that I want to ask you is this. Now, according to reports that are coming in from Bakhmut, it appears that the Russians are pretty much on the verge of victory in taking this East Ukrainian city. Now, what do you make of the tactics that Russia has in fact employed? Why is it that Russia has thrown so much of its resources to try and capture this one city?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's not explainable using military logic. I mean, there's nothing there that's extremely important. It doesn't occupy high ground. It is true that, if you take Bakhmut, then the next cities, are easier to get to, but that applies to just about any city in the relatively flat area of eastern Ukraine. I think the real significance, you alluded to it, is the fact that this was meant to be a prestige product for the Wagner Group. This was where the Wagner Group was going to show that it could operate independently and seize an actual city that was pretty well defended without the assistance of the regular Russian army, and basically set itself apart as sort of an elite group. Obviously, that didn't work out. I think that what people are arguing or fighting over here now is really fighting over prestige. I think the Ukrainians have probably prepared lines of defense beyond Bakhmut for the eventuality of it falling. And I think the Ukrainians are basically bleeding out the Russian forces in Bakhmut.
I'll talk to you a bit about, how the Ukrainians are bleeding the Russians out. But tell us a bit about the impact, psychological impact that this would have on the Ukrainians who are now defending if they were to lose Bakhmut.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Any loss of a Ukrainian city, particularly one you fought over, is bound to initially, at least, be a setback. However, with skillful management, and the Ukrainians have proven to be masters of good public relations, you can convert a military defeat into a psychological, sort of a galvanizing thing. So recall the British defeat at Dunkirk. That was seen to be a heroic example of withdrawal, even though the British forces left most of their equipment in France and a lot of soldiers. Similarly, the siege of Mariupol, which ultimately ended in defeat for Ukraine, that is still viewed as a symbol of national strength. The challenge is, I think, with Bakhmut, first off, they do have a good record of causing Russia. Russia has basically punched out its offensive capabilities in Bakhmut. Their ability to mount an offensive anywhere else is in great question because of so many vehicles they've lost, so many personnel they've lost, and so much artillery expended. If the Ukraine manages to follow this up with a counterattack in another section on the lines, which is effective, then I think Bakhmut will be portrayed as a very, very successful diversionary operation, basically a bleeding out an economy of force operation. So I think Ukraine, this is not a death blow for Ukraine.
This won't be a death blow for Ukraine. It's interesting. But also, according to reports that are now coming in, because all of these at this point of time are only reports, it's difficult to independently verify them. It is being said that Ukraine, in Bakhmut, for every soldier that it loses, it's managing to kill about 7 Russian soldiers. Do you agree with that kind of estimate?
We don't know a whole lot about Ukrainian casualties. The Ukrainians have been very, very good at controlling what we see of them. So, for example, I spent hours a day looking over open source imagery of the war, and I've never seen a Ukrainian fuel truck. So we only see what the Ukrainians would want, but that does seem to make sense. The estimates we've seen of Russian casualties have been about 30,000, which is just a breathtaking number. And what a lot of those casualties are, prisoners, relatively poorly trained Russian forces from the recent mobilization. So, and given the tactics and the poor leadership employed by the Russians, just throwing people at the Ukrainian offenses, that level of casualties, 7-1, that is not out of the realm of the possible, but I can't say definitively.
Absolutely indeed. Now, beyond Bakhmut, also considering that a lot has been spoken about a spring offensive by the Russians and a spring counter-offensive by the Ukrainians. Now, the spring season is here, the snow is beginning to melt, but we've not actually seen a lot of fighting outside of Bakhmut at this point in time in terms of a focused push to try, change the back lines. Do you expect something like that to happen after the Bakhmut, or could it happen simultaneously while the forces are busy engaged in Bakhmut?
I think it can. We haven't seen any indication that the new modern equipment that Ukraine is getting has been employed in Bakhmut. Ukraine has mostly been conducting defensive operations from static positions with their older former Soviet Union bloc equipment. New equipment is arriving and being fielded, and this includes equipment that would allow the Ukrainians to maneuver. There has been a lot of fighting along the level of the front, and there was another Soviet offensive in the south in Vuhledar, which catastrophic losses for the Russians. I mean, we're talking 2 complete regiments basically destroyed. I think that area around the Vuhledar salient, which would allow the Ukrainians to direct fires on the sole rail link running overland to Crimea, I think that for my money, that's where we'll see a Ukrainian offensive. I think the Russians, it's an open question. I think most military experts feel that the Russians no longer have the ability to mount a significant offensive on the front.
All right, it's interesting because this is something that has been spoken about a lot for the last several months. To say that Russia is virtually, will run out of the missiles that it has been using. But what we saw earlier this morning, that Russia has in fact fired a barrage of missiles into Ukraine, targeting 7 cities. Do you think these estimates and assessments that were earlier made, that Russians have in fact run out of their ammunition, and that would make it easier for the Ukrainians to in fact defend their territory? Do you think those assessments had been way too optimistic?
Well, the assessments was focused on tactical artillery ammunition, not missiles. So missiles, I've never heard an estimate that they're going to run out of missiles because those are viewed as strategic assets. What we're talking about are things used on the battlefield. So 152 millimeter artillery shells, 120 millimeter rockets, 122 millimeter artillery shells. We have indications that the Russians have had to dig deep into decades-old war reserve stocks. We've also seen that the Russians, I've seen on social media videos of 1950s era armored vehicles being loaded onto rail cars. We've seen T-62 tanks, which obviously are from 1962, again being loaded on rail cars. So there is indication that at the tactical level, the Russian logistic systems are being stretched.
All right, my final question to you, Colonel, is this. How do you see, in the course of the next few weeks, this war progressing?
Yeah, I think that if what we think we know about Ukraine is correct, I think what you'll see is the Russians will have punched themselves out and don't have the ability to mount a large-scale offensive. We're seeing a collapse of Russian morale, most recently a unit from Kaliningrad, which basically said we refuse to go into combat because we're being poorly led and mistreated. And I think that we will see a Ukraine mobile counteroffensive. Everybody expects it in the south. Nobody expected the Ukrainian offensive that took Kharkiv in the spring, so they may have a trick up their sleeve, but right now the conventional choice is some sort of thrust towards the Sea of Azov to interdict the rail lines to Crimea.
All right, very interesting indeed. Of course, interesting to see as to how this battle, of course, progresses here. Thank you very much indeed, Colonel Dino, for joining us and getting us all those insights. It remains to be seen as to what actually happens in the Battle of Bakhmut. Because Russia is on the cusp of a victory, but will this victory essentially prove to be a Pyrrhic victory for the Russians? Or will this now allow the Russian soldiers to in fact stage more offensives on some of the other bigger urban areas within Ukraine? That of course is something that we will find out. But thank you very much indeed, Colonel Dino, for joining us and getting us all those insights.
It's an honor, thank you.
Beyond is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.